It's not hard. It's like this.
And way after us.
Okay.
There were four?
Let's just put it on Rachel. She was leading. Sorry, it's so much.
I did a good job. No.
Yeah.
The ending.
Do you grade the test?
Nope.
I mean, the regular brochure was good.
The regular brochure was.
Okay, so we're going to have 2 classes more about the early medieval period before we start to get into Gothic. So what we're looking at today is medieval monasteries, and we've talked a lot about them already in different aspects, but this is kind of a how were they built, how did they function, what are the parts of them, and what is their impact on medieval society. The bottom line is a lot of impact. Yes. Your jacket. Yes. Oh, I just turned the heat on though.
Still kind of cold.
Okay. All right, so we're going to first look at a couple different orders, a couple different monastic orders, which will help us kind of understand. Will help us kind of understand the function, what they did, what their purpose was. We have first to look at the Benedictine order. This was really the first type of monastic order. Earlier in the church, there were monks, right? But it wasn't really set up in the way that we know it today as a monastery, as a group of people living together. The early monks were just hermits. Or in the case of that early monastery of St. Catherine's in Sinai that we saw, it was maybe a few people, but there wasn't really a specific order. It was just kind of a group of people living together, kind of living the same life, but there wasn't really anything set up. So you'd have hermits or you'd have just these little groups of people. But what Benedict did is he set up a rule, he set up an order for people to live. And basically every monastic order following, every religious order, whether we're talking about women religious, whether we're talking about men religious, whether we're talking about lay religious, they are all kind of indebted in some way to the rule that St. Benedict followed. The Benedictine rule still today is just about the same as what he founded it in the 500s. So, or late 400s, early 500s. Mm-hmm.
Were monks? Were monks priests?
Not necessarily. So you can be a monk who's not a priest. So there's a few different categories of religious.
But then I can't say mass.
Correct. So a professed religious, always takes these 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, right? A priest is a priest, right? So for a priest, you have what's called a secular priest, or a religious priest.
What are most of the priests on like normal day life?
So a secular priest is any Father Nargang, Father Gilbert, Father McFarland, any of your parish priests. They're considered a secular priest. Okay? What vows do they take?
I don't know. Obedience.
Oh, poverty, chastity, and obedience.
Nope,
Oh, no, not poverty.
not poverty.
Chastity and obedience.
Yep. So they take the vows of chastity, and they have to take a vow of obedience to their bishop, to whoever their superior is. Usually it's a diocesan bishop, right? So Father Signs, he has a vow of obedience to the bishop of Phoenix.
Wait.
Okay?
Why not poverty?
Because they have to live in the world. They have to live in the world. So they don't have to take that vow. Now you can have a religious priest who takes all 3 vows. So a professed religious can either be, we're kind of doing the same thing here, can either be a priest or a brother, sister, etc.
So what happens if a brother becomes a priest, like a monk becomes a priest?
They're still part of the Benedictine order,
So
or
they
the
still
Benedictine
have
priest.
that poverty vow, or
Yep.
does that get kicked out?
Yep.
But they get to like have
No. They still have a vow of obedience to their abbot. And they follow the rule. So you can have a Franciscan priest, you can have a Benedictine priest, you can have a Cistercian priest, right?
How do you become a monk and then become a priest? Like you can't just leave the monk.
Well, it's so being a monk, that's not really an order, right? It's not a sacrament to become a professed religious, to become a brother or a monk, right, or a sister.
You can just leave it at any point. What about vows?
Well, you take vows, but that's not a sacrament. Certainly, you get graces from doing that, but it's not a sacrament.
Like, isn't it like the convent? Like you take vows and you can't leave the convent.
Right, but it's not a sacrament. It's not holy orders.
How do you become a priest then?
So usually then they will send you to a seminary. So they'll send you to any number of seminaries that they have a relationship with. So every monastery will have a relationship with a seminary where if someone who's already made their vows, or maybe you want to go into a monastery and you say, hey, I want to become a Benedictine priest. Great. Join our order first, see if the life is good for you, then we'll send you to go be a priest, and then you come back.
Can you become a priest without? If you're a monk and then you become a priest, can you just like get the monkhood? Yeah, get rid of the monkhood.
If you've taken your perpetual vows, no. Not without special dispensation, and that usually comes from like the Vatican. Yeah. And it's like a 12-year long process. You don't just join real quick.
Yeah.
Usually you do vows like once a year. Hey, I vow to stay for once a year. And then after a certain time, then we're going to do a 6-year, and then now is your final, and that's forever.
Okay, so your father Thomas Aquinas,
Yeah.
does he practice paritas and obedience, or is
Yep.
just
He's Benedictine. So he's a religious priest. He's part of the Benedictine order.
So what
Got
would
the
be
latest models of the T-Bus.
Father response?
He really does.
Secular priest.
He loves seeds, by the way.
Right? So most of the priests that you know, most of the priests that we get our sacraments from, secular priests. Okay? Okay? Makes sense? So that's what a monastery is, right? It's a group of brothers, it's a group of sisters, it's a group of religious, right? The broader term is religious. Okay? So Benedict started this monastery. This is the monastery of Monte Cassino.
That's so cool.
Obviously, it's not what it looked like when he started it. That's what it looks like today. What is the Benedictine order? Uh-huh. What is the Benedictine order? The idea is to live as simple as the life possible, with simple food, basic accommodation, and as few possessions as were practical.
A great view.
And a great view. The monks were expected to live together in a shared community of mutual aid and watchfulness, participating in physical labor needed to make the monastery economically self-sufficient, as well as undertake religious studies and prayer. Yeah.
Are they allowed to play games like sports, basketball, or
Yeah.
something? They can? Okay.
Yeah. Different orders, different things will do different things. So anyone know what the motto or the slogan of the Benedictines is?
Pray and work.
Pray and work.
Yeah, or
Right? Ora et labora, right? So their idea is prayer and work is a prayer. So they spend their whole lives in prayer or work, right? They generally they are generally living in silence, except for necessities, right? If you have to say something, you can say something. Usually there's a day or two off a week where they can speak freely. That's their recreation day. They have a day off. At the Benedictine monastery down in New Mexico that I'm most familiar with, like Monday is their day, right? So Sunday is day of prayer still. It's the Lord's Day. Monday, they go to Mass, they do their breakfast, they do their chores, and then they spend the rest of the afternoon. They go on hikes, they play football, they do whatever. That's their kind of day off. Then they can chat and talk and whatever. And then they go to Vespers, and then the silence begins again. St. Benedict developed a basic alphabet or a language, and it was sign language. And it's a very simple sign language. I don't remember how many words, it's less than 100 words, because St. Benedict said, these are all the words that a monk needs to fulfill his day-to-day life. You don't need to chat using sign language like, American Sign Language today. So it's simple things like, thank you. So you just say, thank you. So if someone passes you something, you'll see the monks do that at the table. You still have manners, but it's just done with sign language, right? Or, bread is something simple. It's like this, right? Or milk is, something different. It's very, very simple. So you can ask for the bread, you can ask for the milk, but you can do it in silence, right? You're still keeping that contemplative spirit. Other orders are much more strict. We have the Cistercians that we'll talk about in a little bit. They don't talk at all. Like, there's monks who have gone years without speaking.
So
That's
would
the whole
you forget how to
idea.
talk?
Huh?
Would you forget how to talk?
It would be weird to talk
That's
again, wouldn't you?
fascinating.
Yeah. All right, so a set of regulations. This is collectively known as the monastic rule with a capital R, that monks had to follow. The severity in the practice is really down to individual abbots, although if you're a Benedictine monastery, you need to follow the rule of Saint Benedict.
Is that order still around?
Yeah,
No,
Benedict.
no, the other one.
Cistercians? Mm-hmm.
Wait,
Where,
so they
where are
don't,
they?
you're saying that
There's
they
some in
don't
France.
talk at all, like even during mass, like they don't respond.
Well, they'll respond in prayers. They'll speak prayers, but they don't speak to each other. Everything just works in clockwork. Everything is just quiet. If we have some time, I'll show you a
I thought we were gonna try.
I'll show you a video. Yeah, we'll try it.
We're gonna try this the best. I'm like, okay, I will fail.
Usually, whatever happens whenever a monastery is founded, usually there's going to be a sister convent, right? That's founded. They follow the same rule. There's usually not very many differences between a Benedictine sister and a Benedictine brother, right? The only difference is it's different monasteries, it's different congregations. So we have Saint Benedict, who started the Benedictine order. His sister, Saint Scholastica, she started the Benedictine sisters, right? And so they had a monastery right nearby. And so yes, there was going to be some visitation between them. The priests would go and visit the sisters and say mass for them, etc. And there's going to be working together. There's going to be collaboration. But essentially, they are separate monasteries. You're also going to notice as you read through some things, if you read books, you're going to see this building or this complex referred to as a convent, even though it's filled with male religious. That's pretty standard, especially in different languages. They don't have, in English, we usually call it a monastery for men and a convent for women. That's usually not the case in most other languages. So you'll see the convent of San Marco. Well, that's a Dominican monastery. So just so you know. Monasteries grew in sophistication and wealth because we've talked about this a little bit before, the monasteries were really a hub of culture for a location, for a city. Not so much the Benedictines, because they were more secluded. Different orders are going to have different rules, right? The Benedictines are more secluded. They want to stay away from the world. Whereas you have Dominicans. Dominicans are an order of teaching, right? So they're going to be out and about. Franciscans are going to be a different kind of religious order. They're going to be focused on teaching, or they're going to be focused on preaching, right? And so, again, different monasteries, different abbots are going to have different rules. But basically, there's going to be always some sort of impact within the community for a monastery.
What kind of rules can the abbot change? Like, because he can't change the actual principle, can he?
No, he can't change the actual principle, but he could do things like, for instance, one monastery would decide to have 2 days of talking instead of 1 day, while still keeping the spirit, the broader spirit of, well, we should be in prayer and silence, but he can relax certain things. Or
Could he say no talking at all?
he could, sure. It probably wouldn't be smart for him to do that because they're not Cistercians, they're Benedictines, right? So you want to kind of follow the rule that you're in, but he could. So because, so early on, the monks were all about self-sufficiency, labor, all that kind of stuff. But as they grew in wealth, and I don't mean in a bad way, their monasteries became just wealthy. They had a lot of land, people would grant them land. Why? Well, you want to support the monks, you want to support the spiritual fathers of your location. But also, there's safety, right? So there's going to be a lot of trade. The monasteries are going to be a place where people can easily trade in safety. They're going to see the abbot almost as like a governor or a mayor of their area. Why? Because the abbot is a respected man, or the abbess in many cases, right? The abbess in a lot of places is going to be very, very powerful. She's going to be the most powerful woman in basically probably the entire country.
What's an abbess?
An abbess is a female abbot, like the head of a convent of sisters. Okay, so you have an abbot or an abbess, depending. And the abbot or the abbess, what they say goes. They have absolute authority within their convent, within their monastery. So much so that they are basically on equal footing with the bishop who is in the same area. So the bishop isn't going to tell the abbot what to do, the abbot isn't going to tell the bishop what to do in his diocese. They are equals. They're absolutely on equal footing. But separate but equal, essentially.
So what if the bishop told them to do something, would they have to listen?
Only if like the Pope got involved. But the bishop wouldn't. So this is just an idea of where Monte Cassino is. Right? They built it on a mountain, right, away from the town, away from the city, again for prayer and recollection.
It's a huge mountain.
Hangman's Hill.
Yeah. So this is an idea of where it is. Now, this is in Italy. What happened is this is a really, there's a few towns, and this is basically the only valley in and out of some larger cities nearby. So what happened during World War II is the Italian Axis army, Mussolini's army, kicked out the monks. And they used Monte Cassino as basically a firing range to basically cover that whole valley, to control the whole valley. It was in a perfectly military strategic point. So they kicked the monks out. The monks had to go to a different monastery. They forced them out. And so the Axis powers took that monastery over. And sadly, because it was a strategic point and because the Axis held that mountain, the Americans bombed it. Which, for right or for wrong, they bombed it. So the Americans were able to bomb it, and they were able to take over Monte Cassino. That's what it looked like during World War II. Absolutely
Wait, that's what all of them?
demolished. That's what it looked like after World War II.
The mountain?
Yep.
That's what
Is that the picture? Is that?
But they were able to rebuild it. So it's been rebuilt basically.
People actually, the monks actually live there.
They do. Mm-hmm.
How do they afford that?
Tons of donations came pouring in from all over. Like, let's rebuild the monastery, the main monastery of the Benedictines.
So it's
So now it's
paid
been
off
rebuilt.
everything?
Yeah. Yeah.
Was that what it looked like before the bombing? Or
Pretty
do we
close.
know?
Pretty close. No, yeah, we have pictures of it. We have pictures. There's drawings. So they rebuilt it pretty much in the same way, but
What does casino mean?
I don't know. I think that's just the name of the town. The town on the bottom is called Casino, and then that's Monte, the Mount Casino. The Cistercians, slightly different. They were kind of a derivative of the Benedictines, although what they did is we have during the year 1000 or so, 800s, 900s, 1000s, Benedictines were really the only game in town for a long time, which was fine. But then we have different orders starting to come about, right? You have St. Francis in the 1200s starting to, he founds the Franciscans.
What does it take to
Right.
start an order?
You have to have approval from the Pope. You have to have approval from the Pope, which all of them have done. And so we have the Cistercians. They started in about the 11th century. Some monks wanted an even stricter lifestyle for themselves than what the Benedictines did. So they have less of an emphasis on physical labor and more of an emphasis on religious studies. Labor instead was done by hired hands. So they have the grounds, they have the monastery, and so they would hire people to work it, and then the monks themselves would be studying. And because land brings in money, that can support the monks just not working, but just studying and praying. So again, it's just a different way of living. Different monastic orders have different rules, and that's perfectly fine. But the thing about the Cistercians is their lifestyle was very severe. Their architecture, although beautiful, was also fairly severe. No artwork. You go into a Cistercian monastery or church even today, it's very plain. It's rough, right? It's rugged. That just kind of fits with their ethos of their way of living. So it's beautiful, it's pretty, but there's not going to be a lot of the flamboyant, beautiful paintings and sculptures and things like that you're going to see. The buildings are going to be very plain, but very functional, right? It's very practical. The Cistercian lifestyle is very practical, very austere. Even modern-day Cistercian monasteries follow that same sort of thing. This is a modern-day Cistercian church. It's very, very plain. It's still modern, but it's following that same sort of idea. All right, so what do monasteries look like? Well, they come in all different shapes and sizes. They come in all different plans, all different areas. This is Cluny Abbey. This is one of the biggest ones in France. This was founded in 910. Yeah, still in existence today. Cluny it had 460 monks at its peak in the 12th century. This is pretty big. Most monasteries are going to be capped out at about 100. Some for practical reasons, there's not enough room, but also because it just gets too big. If there's enough people, then what an abbot would do is he would say, all right, junior abbot, whoever, second in command, third in command, or someone else from among his brothers, he would say, I want you to take a group and I want you to go start another one. So that happened all the time. That's how monasteries spread. So one monastery wouldn't get really big. He would say, all right, this area, this is starting to grow in population. People need sacraments, people need mass. Go start a monastery there. So they would kind of set out these satellite missions of monasteries all over the place. So this is Cluny Abbey. This is what it still looks like today. It's not as big as it was, but some of the original buildings are still there.
Why'd they make it smaller?
They sold off parts of it, and you'd see that all the time with monasteries. They sold off part of the land, they sold off part of the buildings, etc. It's still pretty big. All right, so what is the abbot? The abbot was elected. So it's every 12 or 20 years or something like that. And it depends on the rule, the specific religious order we're talking about. An abbot comes up for re-election. And
Re-elected?
Oh, I thought that was for life.
Well, again, different rules are going to have different things. In most orders, once an abbot is elected, then it is for life. So the abbot dies, and then there's going to be an election. And then you hold that for life. But some orders are going to have it for 12 years or 20 years, or, hey, there's some triggering event. We're going to split the two monasteries apart. Now I don't know. There's all these sorts of bylaws written in. But broadly speaking, once an abbot is elected, he's an abbot for life. And again, it can range from 460 monks down to 12 monks, right? You can start a monastery with just a few. He's going to be assisted by a prior, right? So a prior basically in charge of day-to-day life. The abbot's kind of the head. And then there's monks that are given certain administrative duties. So obedientiaries who look at various aspects of the monastery, such as the church, religious services, library. So there's a librarian, there's a sacristan, right? You get all these certain duties. But the abbot is going to be, again, the main person who's going to be in charge of the monastery, but he's also going to represent the monastery in outside communications. His name is on the deed. He's going to be working with the local landowners. He's going to be the one hiring and firing workers and things like that. He's going to be the representative of the monastery with the bishop or with the pope or things like that. So he really is the head, or the abbess. She's going to be the head of this. So let's look at Cluny Abbey. And we're going to look at another plan here in a little bit. But you can see how it's really set up as a self-sufficient city. And we're going to see that over and over again. Monasteries are meant to be self-sufficient. They want to be self-sufficient. They don't want to rely on outside help. Sometimes they do, but for the most case, they want to be entirely self-sufficient. So let's look at the parts of the monastery. Let's look at the architecture of the monastery. The first thing we're going to look at is the outside wall. There's usually a wall of some kind. Right? A wall of some kind, again, separating the monks from the outside world. That's important. There's always, even if you're not going to be in silence all day, you're still going to want to be separated. There's still going to be some sort of a need for separation from the world. So it depends on geography, right? Sometimes you're at the top of a mountaintop, and so you don't need a big wall. Sometimes the mountain is your wall. But in other cases, you would need that. At the heart of the monastery, we have what's called the cloister. The cloister is an open garden with a walkway around it. And this is meant to represent the Garden of Paradise. This is meant to represent Eden. This is a place for recollection. This is a place for prayer. Oftentimes you'll have the monks reciting the daily office, right? The prayer of the church. And they're just going to be walking around in a circle as they're reciting the prayer. Or they'll be sitting in the garden reciting. Or they're going to be, working in the garden. This was really the heart of the monastery. This was the beating heart of the monastery. But right next to the monastery, right next to the cloister.
Look at the design.
Goodness. But right next to the cloister, this is a zoomed out view, you have the church. So the cloister is always going to butt right up to the church. A second church, because the monastery is big enough to need a second church.
So that other picture before was another church.
They're rich.
Mm-hmm.
That is so pretty.
So adjoining the church was the belfry tower. Obviously important for calling the monks to service, right? You don't have an alarm clock, you don't have electronics, you live by the bell, right? The bell is going to tell you everything you need to know. When to wake up, when to come for Vespers and Compline and all that kind of things. But of course we need some practical things. We need storehouses, we need cellars, right? So plenty of places for brewing beer. In Germany, France, this was the main source of income for most monasteries was brewing. And so they would set up their monastery right next to a river, right next to a good water source, and then they would brew the beer.
That's crazy.
Right? Or they would ferment wine, or they would make all sorts of other things, right? Some of the more famous liquors that we have today, right? Fra Angelico. That's a hazelnut liqueur made by monks. We have Trappist beer. We have, what are some other ones? Grand Marnier. We have Chambord, right? Especially some of these really fancy, like European liqueurs. Those all come from monasteries, and they're still made by monasteries today.
Which of the monks make them?
Was that ever a problem that there was just like the cellar full of alcohol?
No, because they weren't allowed to drink it except for special occasions.
That's funny.
Yeah, or they would drink it very watered down, right? Again, in medieval times, very, very much watered down beer, like 0.5% alcohol. That was more sanitary than drinking water. So they would drink that, but it wouldn't get you drunk. You could drink that all day.
That's such a pretty cellar, by the way.
It is. Inside, we have a chapter house for the daily meeting. So the abbot or the prior would hold a meeting with the monks. This is what's going on today. These are the things we need to do, practical things, but also spiritual things, right? Here's the lesson for the day. Here's the reading for the day. And they vary in size and in beauty depending on the monastery. Sometimes they're very simple. Sometimes they're beautiful like that. This would often be used as well for reciting the office. If the weather's bad, all the monks would gather in here and recite the office together. Yeah.
Let's see.
We've talked about one of the major works of a monastery was reproducing books, right? Reproducing missals, reproducing Bibles, and reproducing secular works as well. The works of Aristotle, the works of Ovid, right? The works of Plato. Monasteries would do this, and they would do this in a room. It's called a scriptorium. Scriptorium usually has bright windows,
That's crazy.
big windows, so you don't have to worry about writing by candlelight all the time. And it's usually facing south. Again, in the northern hemisphere, that's where the sun is going to be most of the time, and so those windows are usually facing south. Not in all monasteries, but that's a scriptorium. And again, some of them are smaller. Right? This is an older picture of a monastery, and so they would set up their desks, and this is the place where you do your writing. So there would be certain monks who would be the scriptorium, be working in the scriptorium. Other ones would be working in the garden. Some would be working in the stables, etc. Of course, you need to eat, so you eat in a refectory. The monks are usually lined up on tables along the side. The abbot and the other head monks are at a table in the front. What are the meals? Usually meatless all the time, most of the time.
So there on top right.
How do you not like laugh?
What's that?
How do you not like talk or like laugh?
So usually someone is going to be reading a lesson from up there, right? And so they're going to be reading. So that way you're going to be listening to the lesson of the day or a book, or sometimes they listen to podcasts, right? They'll just play a podcast. Yeah. Yep. So they'll do that. But the abbot he'll be the one, once he comes in, then everyone comes and sits down, and then once he starts to eat, then you can start to eat. And the food is very simple, right? But it's enough. Lots of beans,
Lettuce.
lots of vegetables, lots of bread, lots of milk, lots of cheese, right? Things like that. And it's usually all things that were made there or baked there. On feast days, yeah, you would have fish, and every now and then you might get some meat. Again, depending on the rule of the monastery.
You don't ever like look at fish?
Rarely. Again, poverty.
I didn't know McDonald's.
I wouldn't eat my protein.
Poverty. The only time that they have really nice things is if someone donates it to them, and sometimes they'll save it for a special occasion.
But like, what if they are working with like a cow and it dies?
So they would, but they would probably sell it. They would probably sell the meat instead, and then they would, right? They would probably sell it.
What is that?
So this is called a calefactory. This is an important room. Because this was where you would get all your hot water. So there would be a monk who would be in charge of keeping the fires going in the calefactory, and that's going to be boiling the water. And then they would have plumbing set up. And so you'd have hot running water through all the places. It's a great place. And in many cases, what you would have is you would have a calefactory that's pretty long. This is a small one. But you'd have a pretty long calefactory. And then the dormitories would be right above it.
Nice.
So that way it's heated, right? So the ambient heat from the fires below is going to keep the monks warm during the winter.
It really
I love that part of
helps.
that. Is very cool.
All right. So this isn't an actual monastery, but this is what this artist did is he basically took all the parts of a monastery and kind of here's a broad picture of what a monastery would look like. All right, so cloister, right? This is, like I said, the beating heart. The church is right next to it. And you have towers. Here's your entrance so that people from the outside can come in and can come right to the church. But there's going to be a wall right there, so you can't get into the rest of the monastery. Okay? So your cloister, parlor, seating area. You have the dormitory for the monks.
Parlor used for.
For study, for work, sometimes for chapter meetings, things like that. Kitchen and refectory. So basically, your whole life as a monk is right in here. Okay? As we move to the outside, you can see the entrance so that people can walk into the church. And then you have a hostel, which is basically a not fancy at all motel, basically. So travelers, people who are traveling or visiting can come and stay at the hostel, right? And it's basically outside the walls. You have a guest house for nicer, more important guests, right? So a visiting priest is coming or whatever, and you have a kitchen to serve them. You have the abbot's house, and then the school is going to be up there. So local kids would come, and the monks would teach them. The scriptorium and the library, again, this is facing north. In most cases, it's facing south, but whatever. And then totally separated out is the infirmary, which again makes sense. You have sick people, you don't want them in here, you move them out. And so the physician's office is here. Bloodletting, love that part. Herb garden, so that the physician can make medicines from the herbs. You have another chapel here, and then this is the novitiate, right? These are the people who are just joining the monastery, who aren't quite there yet.
What's bloodletting?
So there was the idea that you would, if you were sick, you had bad blood in you, and so they would let all the blood out.
They would bleed you out.
It's like a risk for you.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kills
So you die.
Well,
Most of the time.
most of the time you would try not to, but yeah.
Oh, they would just try to like just.
And then all around here we have all of this stuff, right? This is hospice for the poor, again, right near the entrance. So this is where people would, if you were poor, you could come in and you could get food. Sheep, pigs, goats, horses, cows, brewery, bakery, mortars, kilns, artisans, workshops, barns and granaries, vegetables, gardeners, and then a cemetery and an orchard.
Only monks can be buried in the cemetery.
Correct.
It's like their own little world.
It's entirely their own world. They're entirely self-sufficient. They have everything they need. They don't leave. You don't need to leave, and that's the
Right,
point.
You go to the cemetery, you get to pick an orange.
Yeah.
Cemetery.
Huh.
There's
Cemetery.
Tastes like Roger.
Oh,
Sorry, that was gross. Okay, so again, monasteries are going to be very much the center of society. People are going to build their houses around the monastery. Were monasteries attacked? Yeah, absolutely. But
Wait, so like
All
the
the
people,
time.
the faithful go to the mass at the
Yep.
monastery?
and so you could go in right through this gate, and you could go right into the church here.
So that means that
But there's a wall here separating, so you wouldn't be going into the monastery itself. You're just going into the church, and then you go right back out.
so that means that they weren't cloistered.
They would be, because the monks would enter in from this side, and there's a gate in the middle of the church.
So you're not allowed to see them.
You can see them. Well, again, depends on the order. But if it's like Benedictines or Franciscans or something, there's just a gate separating. So the faithful are back here, the monks are up there. You can see them. Sometimes you can talk to them outside afterwards. Again, depending on the rule, depending on the severity of the rule, right? You have the Carmelites, for instance, who are very much segregated. You can't see them, right? There is no contact with the outside world. Period.
You watch mass and attend mass.
So in a Carmelite
They were
church,
Blackfield.
they're going to be in basically a side area.
Yeah.
So the church is separated almost like an L.
Yeah.
So they can see the altar, you can see the altar, but you can't see them, and there's a veil in front.
Which side of this do they see, the right side or?
Right.
It just depends on how it's how it's built.
Dude, but why
You can
do
see them
that?
doing the
What's the
consecration.
reason for that?
Because they are totally shut off from the outside world. They are the most severe. They're the most strict out of all the rules.
For nuns?
You're not supposed
Mhm.
to, but we did.
Okay, Um,
Where are they located?
What?
all over,
Crazy.
all
Oh,
over.
that's awesome.
So I do want to show you this one. This is a crazy monastery. A friend of mine has gone here, and they don't accept a lot of visitors. They accept maybe 50 to 100 visitors a year. Period. This is on Mount Athos, and Mount Athos it's at the edge of this peninsula in Greece, and it's right at the very end. It's very difficult to get to. You have to take a ferry to get to it. This is an Orthodox monastery. And they still are in existence today. It's a small community, maybe 50 monks with an abbot. And this is how you get to it.
Whoa.
You can't get to it from land. You can only get to it from water.
No way.
And it is actually a small island. Women are not allowed on the island, period. End of story, ever, never. No woman has ever been on this island. Well, not ever, but since the foundation of the monastery, no woman has ever been there. So I'm showing you this as kind of an extreme example of,
Storms are actually crazy.
yeah.
Gosh, that's gorgeous.
It is,
That's so
so what is the purpose of this, right? The purpose is to, again, completely shut yourself away from the world. You can see nature, you can see the mountains, you can see the sea, but you can't see anyone else.
What are the vows you take there?
The same ones, but again, the rule is going to be much more strict.
How many years is a vow? Like what? Like you said, you do 1116 and forever.
It's like a freaking resort.
I'm not exactly sure.
yeah, it looks like
I think it's good. Like,
It is.
can they go swim?
I would guarantee you they have.
You go cliff jumping? Yeah.
So they do have gardens. They do have some animals in the back, but basically,
Are there vegan?
They're still self-sufficient. I think so, pretty much, huh?
Did your friend take pictures or are they not allowed to?
Wasn't allowed to. You have to have special permission to do that.
So like you couldn't even take a picture like this.
They would probably come out in a little boat and be like, "What are you doing? Why are you here? I mean, if you're here to visit, welcome, but we're not accepting visitors. Like, they're not going to shoot you."
So are they like watching over the seas 24/7?
They're very protective.
Oh.
So this is Orthodox.
Holy
So they get a lot of support from the outside. They get a lot of money.
Isn't this place like really vulnerable to be like just robbed?
Yeah, but most people who are there, who are living there, are not going to touch this. Like, you don't mess with these guys.
No. You don't mess with that.
And also the Greek government, like if you were to go and try to attack them, the Greek government would come after you.
Crazy.
This is very much a protected.
Where the ceiling stars.
Yeah,
Are they like Roman Catholic or what?
they're Greek Orthodox,
What it means.
so they're split from the Catholic Church.
Is their church mass still valid and stuff?
Valid mass, but you shouldn't go, right? Because it's schismatic,
Yeah.
essentially.
Well, could you go to attend mass and get your mass for Sunday?
Yeah, if that was the only mass, you can go. Yep.
Mr. So then what's this order called again?
Greek Orthodox.
Like, are there other Greek Orthodox, or is this the only one?
No. There's plenty. There's lots.
Then why is this one?
This is a specific monastery of the Greek Orthodox Church. This is just one monastery. They have plenty of monasteries all throughout.
But this isn't a right monastery.
Yeah, you can't go to, right? So Max couldn't join, even if he wanted to, because he really likes the gold. Okay.
Hit run. Money and love. That is so
All right.
cool.
Next
Yeah,
time,
look at the design.
we'll look at the Spanish Peninsula and the influence of Islamic art into the Spanish Peninsula, and then we'll get into Gothic.